Doctors declared Maxwell Alexander dead for 15 minutes. What he experienced in those moments transformed him from a hardened atheist into a devout believer. His story will challenge everything you thought you knew about life after death. I never believed in any higher power. Science was my religion, and Richard Dawkins was my prophet. From my cozy home in Millbrook, Vermont, I spent countless hours on internet forums crushing religious arguments with cold, hard logic. At 52, I had it all figured out: a successful engineering career, a lakeside house, and what I thought was an unshakable worldview. My name is Maxwell Alexander, and this is the story of how I died, met God, and came back a changed man. That morning started like any other. I was tinkering with my prized 1967 Corvette Stingray in my garage, doing some routine maintenance. My neighbor Thomas, a devout Orthodox Christian, waved from his driveway. He'd been trying to convert me for years, poor guy. I'd always shut him down with a mix of scientific arguments and sarcastic quips about fairy tales in the sky. The late autumn air was crisp, and fallen leaves scattered across my driveway. I remember thinking about how the changing seasons were just another example of natural processes requiring no divine intervention. Everything could be explained by science, or so I believed. I was working on replacing the carburetor when something went terribly wrong. The jack holding up the car wasn't properly secured. In my arrogance, I'd ignored basic safety protocols. The massive vehicle shifted, and before I could react, the jack gave way. 2 tons of American muscle came crashing down. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The car had crushed my chest, pinning me to the cold concrete. I could feel my ribs cracking, my lungs struggling to draw breath. Through my dimming vision, I saw Thomas running toward me, phone in hand, shouting something I couldn't make out. Time seemed to slow down. I thought about all those times I'd mockingly asked believers to prove God's existence. "Show me evidence," I demanded. "Give me something tangible." Now, as darkness crept into the edges of my vision, a terrifying thought crossed my mind. What if I was wrong? The last thing I remember was the sound of sirens in the distance, and Thomas praying over me. I wanted to tell him to stop wasting his breath, but I couldn't speak. The world faded to black, and I felt myself slipping away. The paramedics would later tell me that I was technically dead for 15 minutes. My heart had stopped beating, and my brain showed no activity. They had given up hope and were about to call time of death when something inexplicable happened. But what occurred during those 15 minutes changed everything I thought I knew about reality. It shattered my materialistic worldview and forced me to confront truths I had spent a lifetime denying. The moment my heart stopped, I experienced something that defied every scientific principle I'd ever known. There was no tunnel of light, no gentle floating sensation. Instead, I felt myself being violently pulled from my body, like a fish yanked from the depths by an invisible hook. My consciousness expanded in ways I can't fully describe. Imagine suddenly gaining the ability to see in every direction simultaneously, to perceive reality in dimensions beyond our normal 3. The garage, my broken body, Thomas's frantic attempts at CPR, I could see it all from above, but that was just the beginning. I found myself in what I can only describe as a vast courtroom, but one that stretched infinitely in all directions. The walls, if you could call them that, seemed to be made of living light. Not light as we know it, but something more fundamental, more real. Everything in our physical world suddenly felt like a cheap imitation of this reality. Before me stood beings of pure light, angels I now know. Their presence was overwhelming, and their power was palpable. But they weren't the gentle, harp-playing creatures from greeting cards. These were warriors, ancient and terrible, their very existence a rebuke to my lifetime of skepticism. One of them approached me. Its voice resonated not in my ears, but in the very core of my being. "Maxwell Alexander," it said, "your life will now be reviewed." Suddenly, every moment of my life began playing out before me, not like a movie, but as if I was reliving each instant simultaneously. I saw myself as a child, stealing cookies from the kitchen. I saw myself as a teenager, comforting a friend through a difficult time. But I also saw the countless times I'd mocked believers, the arrogance with which I'd dismissed their faith. What shocked me most was seeing the ripple effects of my actions. When I convinced my colleague's daughter that her faith was foolish, I watched as she spiraled into a depression that affected her entire family. When I publicly ridiculed a street preacher, I saw how my words had discouraged others from exploring their spiritual questions. The weight of my actions crushed me more thoroughly than the car had. Each dismissive comment, each sarcastic reply, each moment of pride, they all stood as accusations against me. I had thought I was spreading reason and logic, but I had only been spreading darkness. Then, something even more extraordinary happened. The space around me shifted, and I found myself standing before a presence so overwhelming that I fell to my knees. This was no mere angel. This was the throne of God Himself. The light emanating from it was brighter than 1,000,000 suns, yet it didn't hurt to look at. In fact, I couldn't look away. I felt naked, exposed, every flaw and sin laid bare before perfect holiness. My scientific arguments, my logical proofs against God's existence, they seemed impossibly foolish now, like a child insisting that their teacher doesn't exist while sitting in class. From this presence came a voice that spoke not in words but in pure truth. It showed me how my rejection of God had affected not just me, but countless others. I saw people who might have found faith if not for my influence. I saw how my materialistic worldview had contributed to a culture that pushed God further and further away. But then, something happened that I never expected. Despite seeing all my sins, all my rebellion, I felt love. Not the sentimental love we talk about on earth, but something far more powerful and pure. It was a love that knew everything about me, every flaw, every sin, every moment of rebellion, and loved me anyway. The love I felt was overwhelming, but it wasn't unconditional in the way many modern preachers describe. There was justice mixed with the mercy, truth intertwined with grace. I understood then that while God's love was available to all, it required a response, faith, repentance, and a commitment to follow His ways. I was shown visions of those who had rejected this love, who had chosen to stand on their own righteousness or follow false paths. I saw souls descending into a realm engulfed in flames, their eternal separation from God a consequence of their own choices. The horror of it was beyond description. Not just physical torment from the unquenchable fire, but the absolute absence of hope, love, and light. Then Jesus Himself appeared before me. Not the gentle figure from children's Sunday school pictures, but the King of Kings, whose eyes blazed with divine fire. He showed me how He had died for my sins, how His sacrifice was the only way to bridge the gap between sinful humanity and a holy God. Every scientific argument I had ever made against the resurrection crumbled in the face of His presence. What happened next shattered every remaining fragment of my atheistic worldview. I was given a profound understanding of spiritual reality, how the physical world we see is just a shadow of the true reality. I saw how angels and demons wage war over human souls, how our choices have eternal consequences. I was shown why Orthodox Christianity was the true path, not because other religions didn't contain any truth, but because only through Christ could someone be fully reconciled to God. I saw how other spiritual paths, despite their moral teachings or sincere followers, couldn't address the fundamental problem of human sin and separation from God. The Holy Spirit revealed to me how the modern world had twisted God's truth to fit human preferences. I saw how moral relativism had crept into churches, how ancient truths were being abandoned in favor of cultural acceptance. The message was clear. God's standards hadn't changed, even if society had. I witnessed the reality of judgment, not as a cruel punishment, but as the natural consequence of rejecting God's love and truth. Those who chose to live by their own standards rather than God's, those who rejected His design for human sexuality and relationships, those who pursued worldly pleasure over spiritual truth, they had made their choice, and that choice had eternal consequences. But what struck me most was seeing how my own intellectual pride had been my greatest sin. I had set myself up as the ultimate authority, judging God's existence based on my limited understanding. The irony was crushing. I, a finite being who couldn't even fully understand how my own consciousness worked, had dared to dismiss the infinite God based on my inability to prove His existence in a laboratory. The vision continued, showing me how the sacraments of the Orthodox Church weren't just symbolic rituals but actual channels of divine grace. Baptism, communion, confession, These were spiritual technologies, if you will, designed to connect humans with divine reality. My scientific mind was finally understanding spirituality in a way I never had before. I was shown the true nature of time, how what we experience linearly on Earth exists simultaneously in the spiritual realm. Every prayer ever prayed, every Mass ever celebrated, every act of love or hatred, they all existed in an eternal present before God. This explained how the saints could hear our prayers and intercede for us, something I had always ridiculed as logically impossible. The spiritual realm operated with its own laws, just as consistent as physics but far more complex. I saw how miracles weren't violations of natural law, but the implementation of higher laws we couldn't yet comprehend. My scientific mind was exploding with new understanding, not rejecting reason, but transcending it. As these revelations washed over me, I was brought before Jesus again. This time he spoke directly to me, his voice both terrifying and beautiful. "Maxwell," he said, "you have seen the truth. What will you do with it?" I realized this was the crucial moment. Despite everything I had witnessed, I still had a choice to make. God's love was overwhelming, but he wouldn't force me to accept it. I could still choose to reject it all, to return to my comfortable skepticism. Images flashed before me, my future if I returned to Earth. I saw two distinct paths. In one, I continued in my atheism, dismissing this experience as a hallucination caused by lack of oxygen to my brain. I saw myself growing more bitter, more isolated, eventually dying alone and facing final judgment without excuse. In the other path, I embraced what I had seen. I saw myself getting baptized in the Orthodox Church, learning the ancient prayers, participating in the divine liturgy. I saw myself using my analytical mind, not to tear down faith, but to help others understand it. I saw the people I would help, the lives that would be changed. But this second path wasn't easy. I saw the ridicule I would face, especially from my academic colleagues. I saw family members dismissing me as having brain damage from the accident. I saw internet trolls mocking my testimony. Yet I also saw how each challenge would strengthen my faith, how each trial would draw me closer to God. The reality of hell was made vivid to me, not just as eternal separation from God, but as a place of real, unending fire that consumed without destroying. I understood that it wasn't about punishment so much as it was about respecting human choice. Those who choose to live without God in this life are simply getting their preference for eternity, enduring the flames that symbolize their own unquenched desires and rebellion. Then I was shown something that broke my heart. Faces of people I knew who were on the path to destruction. Friends who practiced other religions sincerely but incorrectly. Associates who lived in open defiance of God's moral law. Even some who called themselves Christians but had never truly submitted to Christ's lordship. I wanted to warn them all. The most sobering revelation was understanding that my intellectual arguments against faith hadn't just affected me, they had influenced others to reject God. Each person I had swayed away from faith was a weight on my conscience. I saw how my Reddit posts, my debates, my sarcastic comments had created ripples of unbelief that extended far beyond my immediate circle. Jesus showed me specific moments where my influence had been particularly damaging. The young woman who had been considering Orthodox Christianity until she read my detailed critique of religious faith. The college student who used my arguments to justify abandoning his family's faith tradition. The teenager who shared my anti-religious memes until he lost all interest in spiritual matters. "These souls are on your hands," Jesus said, "not in condemnation but in truth. What will you do to help them find their way back?" Suddenly, I felt a violent pulling sensation. The heavenly courtroom faded, and I was rushing back toward my body. I heard voices. "We've got a pulse, and he's coming back." Opening my eyes in the hospital was like being born again. Everything looked different. The fluorescent lights, the beeping machines, the concerned faces, they all seemed less real than what I had just experienced. The material world felt like a shadow of true reality. The doctors called it a miracle. Multiple broken ribs, a punctured lung, severe internal bleeding. By all medical logic, I shouldn't have survived. They couldn't explain how I had not only lived, but showed remarkably little brain damage from the extended period without oxygen. Thomas, my Christian neighbor, was the first visitor allowed to see me. He didn't seem surprised when I asked him to contact an Orthodox priest. Through my tears, I told him everything I had seen. He just nodded, smiled, and said, "God has been waiting for you, Maxwell." The weeks that followed were challenging. Physical recovery was difficult, but the spiritual transformation was even more intense. I had to unlearn decades of materialistic thinking. Every time I tried to rationalize or dismiss my experience, the vivid memory of standing before God's throne would snap me back to reality. My colleagues' reactions were exactly as I had been shown they would be. Some suggested PTSD, others blamed oxygen deprivation, and a few simply stopped talking to me. But for every person who walked away, someone else would be drawn to my story, hungry to know more about the God I had encountered. I was baptized into the Orthodox Church 3 months after my accident. As the holy water washed over me, I felt a shadow of that divine presence I had experienced during my death. The divine liturgy, which I had once dismissed as meaningless ritual, now felt like a window into heaven. Today, I use my analytical skills to help others understand the rationality of faith. I've written several books about my experience, but more importantly, I try to undo the damage I did during my atheist years. Instead of tearing down believers, I help skeptics work through their doubts with patience and understanding. Every morning, I thank God for that terrible accident that saved my soul. Physical death had to come before spiritual life could begin. My near-death experience wasn't just about seeing heaven. It was about understanding the awesome responsibility we have in this life to choose truth and help others find it too. If this story has touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell to receive more powerful testimonies like Maxwell's. Together, we can help others discover the life-changing truth about God's reality. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.